Hi, how you doing? I have on average 110 frost-free days, but for melons and squashes in a normal year, I usually have more like around 90 days. If I miss that, I am harvesting unripened produce that has no flavor and it's better off thrown on the compost pile. Today I'm going to share with you exactly how I grow this sometimes difficult family of plants and how these practices help me to get a successful harvest. My name is Sharon and I garden in East Central Saskatchewan, Zone 3. Welcome to my Sask Garden. Today is May 19th and the last of the weekend snow is melting today. We had a 3-day snowfest over the May long weekend and we got it good. It was heavy and it was wet and some of it melted as it fell, but a lot of it accumulated. Over the 3 days, it equaled over an inch of moisture, so the moisture is good. That all kind of came out of the blue, really, and I had to stuff everything back into the greenhouse for those days. In addition, we had a pretty good frost last night. When I woke up this morning, everything was white, grass, roofs. I will also quickly mention that my brassicas that I planted out for the last video, they all did survive the snowfest and the cold and the frost, and they seem to be doing well. Anyways, on to the subject at hand. Every year I use one of my 4x12 raised beds to grow some very tasty melons. I also grow a couple of zucchini every year, some cucumbers, and occasionally I grow some winter squash as well. This family of plants are called cucurbits, and it's pretty huge. It includes cucumbers and watermelons and honeydew and cantaloupe, pumpkin, summer squash, winter squash, zucchini, gourds, and loofah. Except for the loofahs, I have grown pretty much all the others at one time or another, and I continue to grow most of them. In these 2 trays over here, I have this year started seedlings for watermelon and honeydew and cantaloupe, cucumber, zucchini, and 3 kinds of winter squashes. Now, I don't have a big garden, and so I have to be very selective in my choice of variety for many of them because I just don't have the room for really long viney plants. And that brings me to the first and probably the most important tip for success growing many of these in our cold climate, and that is the variety that you choose. With a couple of exceptions, for maximum success, we need to choose our variety wisely so that they do have plenty of time to mature in our growing window, in our short growing window. And so here's the thing, we may have 110 days, frost-free days, but we aren't planting them right at last frost because they need very warm soil. And we want them to mature ideally before last frost because these plants have absolutely no frost tolerance. So right off the bat, you could take 2, 3, or maybe even 4 weeks off your frost-free number of growing days. And that is your ideal melon and winter squash growing window. I said that there were a couple of exceptions, and cucumber is one of those. In general, they all grow fast and they mature fairly quickly, and so choosing varieties for these tends to be based basically on taste and if you want to make pickles or not. Over the years, I have tried many varieties of cucumbers, and now I narrow down my small planting of cucumbers to only the types that are Parthenocarpic, and that means they don't need bees to pollinate them. I usually do have a pretty good supply of bees in the yard, but with my very small planting of cucumbers, they might not always have a bunch of bees buzzing around them all the time because there is lots of blooms happening in the yard all over the place. So Parthenocarpic varieties are my choice. And if you plan to grow in a greenhouse or undercover, or if you have a low bee population, a Parthenocarpic variety should be your choice. I grow Quarantine if I think I want to make some pickles, and I usually also grow a long English cucumber. Quarantine are also fine for fresh eating. They're burpless and they resist going bitter, so they really are a good all-around cucumber. It has also been described as an improved cool breeze, which is another popular Parthenocarpic variety. And this year I'll be growing only some long English cucumbers. I've got starts here for two varieties. One is Summer Dance and the other is Sweeter Yet, both of which I've grown before, both of which are a very good variety. And I'll grow one hill of each, thin to probably 2 plants per hill, and I have some short trellises for them to climb on to take up less space. I am also trying a new, to me, cucumber this year called Mini Me. I'm going to grow those in large containers, and I'm going to use some larger tomato cages to grow the vines. You do not need to start cucumbers ahead of time like I do. As long as the soil temperature is nice and warm, cucumbers are fairly easy to germinate, but that soil temperature has to be warm. On to the melons, and that is watermelons, honeydew, and cantaloupes. And this year I'm going to attempt growing all three in one 4x12 raised bed. There's going to be 2 plants of each. Last year I had good success growing 3 cantaloupe and 3 honeydew together in the same bed. For honeydew melons, the variety you choose matters because there are some out there that require 100 days or more to mature. But there are also shorter season varieties, and I chose one last year called Diplomat. I grew it last year, set fruit early, and it grew beautiful, flavorful honeydew melons. Diplomat is an F1 hybrid seed, and they mature in 65 days. And this is what you want to look for as a cold climate gardener, is quick maturing varieties. Whichever variety you choose, try to choose one with a maturity date of say 80 days or less. Cantaloupe are a little different. They're also often called muskmelon. To make it just a little bit more confusing, all cantaloupes are technically muskmelon, but not all muskmelon are cantaloupes in any case. There's lots of varieties that have a shorter maturity date. I've got the early champ variety seeded here with about a 70-day maturity date. I grew them last year as well, and along with the honeydew, we were eating these melons fairly early. Early champ is a high-yielding, early maturing hybrid cantaloupe known for its thick, sweet, deep orange flesh, and it is absolute deliciousness harvested from the garden. I couldn't believe the flavor of a fresh picked cantaloupe. I guarantee you it is without a doubt nothing like you have ever bought in a grocery store or probably tasted anywhere else unless it was picked from a local garden. And for the watermelon, I used up the last of my seed for the Sureness variety of watermelon. It was 3-year-old seed, still germinated fine for me. This is my favorite of all the watermelons I've ever grown, and I've grown quite a few varieties. Sureness is a yellow fleshed variety, produces smaller 6-pound melons that are incredibly sweet and incredibly juicy, and they mature in 65 days. I have never grown these melons and not harvested mature fruit. They are a very dependable melon. I will mention that melons, the honeydew, the cantaloupe, and the watermelons, they are not Parthenocarpic. They do still need bees to pollinate. So they're not suitable for growing under cover or in a greenhouse unless you incorporate hand pollinating. I also have a couple of previous videos about melons. One is doing a taste test on the Sureness, and I'll link those at the end of this video. And on to the squashes. Squashes are typically divided into summer and winter squashes. Summer squash are thin-skinned, they don't have a long storage life. They include zucchini and patty pan squashes. They're fast-growing, harvested young in the summer, and intended to be used immediately. So the variety of summer squash that you choose is entirely up to you, as they're all pretty much fast growers that mature quickly. The only summer squash that I grow is zucchini. A couple of plants, and I have routinely been growing these in 5-gallon pails. They just seem to produce a little better for me, and it also leaves me more space in my raised beds to grow other things that are not as well suited to containers. This year I'm growing the Gold Rush variety of zucchini. It's a new variety for me, and so far my seedlings are growing really well. I hope they like growing in 5-gallon pails as much as the others did. Like cucumbers, you do not have to start summer squash ahead of time, but it does need that minimum 15°C soil temperature to germinate. Winter squash, on the other hand, have thick, hard rinds. They take much longer to mature, and they're harvested in the fall. and then they can be stored for several months. Winter squashes include butternuts, acorns, pumpkin, delicatas, cabocas, and mashed potato squash and spaghetti squash. Winter squashes take a lot longer to grow and mature, and then the curing process is needed so that they can have that long storage life that we're looking for, and it also improves the flavor. Here are my last 2 butternuts from last year's harvest. They're just beginning to dry out a little, but still mighty tasty, and they have been kept just on a shelf in the basement all winter, not in a cold room. I loved having a store of these butternut squashes over this past winter, and so this year I'm planning to grow a little bit more. Winter squashes, though, are most definitely the ones that you want to pay attention to the variety and the length of time that they take to mature. I like butternuts, and I grow the earliest variety out there that I know of, and that is the early butternut hybrid variety, which has about an 80-day maturity. When you throw in a curing window on top of that of another couple weeks, I really hate to try anything with a longer maturity date. I did this year find a Burpee's Butterbush variety that has the same maturity window, and I have a few of these planted as well. Now, when I talk about curing the winter squashes, this means that after you harvest them, the mature squashes are kept somewhere very warm and in the sun, turning them every so often so they get sun on all sides. This improves the flavor and their storage capability, like I said. Last year I grew 5 plants, and this year I'll grow 6. Both varieties that I have are semi-bush, which I need in my garden because of space. They still vine, and they produce on the vine, but the vines are only maybe 6 feet long, and I didn't find them that difficult to maintain. They probably would grow longer, but I trim them back in late summer once I know that any new fruit that sets won't have time to grow and mature. And around that same time, I also trimmed off a lot of the big leaves to allow the sun to hit those maturing squashes. For a long time, I've wanted to grow delicata squashes, but that long maturity window has stopped me. Also, I couldn't find a bush variety of a delicata, but this year I'm going to give them a try because, for one thing, we've added 2 cattle panel trellises in the vegetable garden, so I'm going to try and grow these delicata vines up the trellises and hope for the best. Delicata do not really require curing and don't have as long a storage life. I've read that being able to cure them in the sun and heat for a couple of weeks may have some slight improvement, but overall these squashes will have to be eaten first. These so far have produced really nice looking seedlings for me, and I'll grow only 4 plants, 2 on each side of one trellis. And finally, the last squash I'm growing is called the mashed potato squash. This is also new to me. It's a small acorn type of squash that when cooked and mashed is said to resemble mashed potatoes, and it is described as a low-carb alternative to potatoes. They are also compact semi-bush plants with white fruit and white flesh. They have a 90-day maturity window, which is a little longer than I like to have. They would also benefit from some curing time in the sun. So it's going to be a try to see how they do in my garden, but when I've mentioned them in previous videos, I have heard comments from many of you that you have had success with the mashed potato squash, and so I'm excited to try them. I'm going to grow 3 plants. But generally what you want for winter squash is that they should be allowed to ripen thoroughly in the field before harvesting them. Winter squash must be picked before your first frost and then cured for 10 days to 2 weeks before storing them. Curing hardens that outer skin, it reduces the high water content, and it improves the eating quality. And to go about curing them, you would pile the fruit in the garden for a couple of weeks during hot, dry weather. Or if that doesn't work, you could keep fruit inside at a room temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius and 80% relative humidity for 4 weeks. That's a pretty hot, steamy indoor room. I used the greenhouse for curing them. That worked really well, but I also had them on a wagon and wheeled them to the south side of the garage for the day. I think ideally what you'd want to shoot for is to be able to harvest these early September and then have those nice, warm, dry days in September, hopefully, to allow them to cure. And as for storage, squash require a room about 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius, dry conditions. You lay them out in single layers without them touching each other. And it's said that they like a relative humidity of 70%. Our basement is a lot drier than that, and they did seem to winter well, although perhaps that's why I'm seeing some dryness now on the last two that I have, possibly. And as for the transplants, so I have all of these transplants going, and I'm just going to talk about them just for a bit. Every year I seed them on May 1st on a heat mat in the house, and they all emerge within 3 to 4 days. Heat makes these seeds germinate fast, and as they germinated, I immediately brought them out here into the greenhouse. I keep my greenhouse heated at night to a minimum of 10 degrees C or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. These plants like really warm soil. They really like to grow in a soil temperature in the 20s or 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. They are all highly sensitive to cold, and growth and yield could suffer if the temperatures drop too far. And you can see here on some of my seedlings these rather elongated stems between the soil and the seed leaves, and they didn't come up that way. You know, the seed leaves came up right on the surface, and then I brought them in here, and they were in high light. They didn't stretch from lack of light here in the greenhouse. They popped up just above the soil like they're supposed to, and but then they began to elongate like this. But I think maybe it could have something to do with the temperature differential in here, that it goes down to 10 degrees at night, and you know, generally it's up, or on a sunny day particularly, it's up around 30 degrees during the day. So that might be too much of a difference, or perhaps too cool at night, and that is what has made them stretch. It's actually the first time I've ever had such a long stem, and particularly on these mini me cucumbers. But you know, the stem is strong. It's not like it's falling over or anything, so I think it's going to be okay. And I almost always start my transplants, but you can certainly direct sow some of these. And as I said, they'll need a minimum soil temperature of 15 degrees C, but warmer is better. And remember that soil temperature and not the air temperature, because especially at this time of year, that is different. That's way different. I took the soil temperature yesterday, and the soil was 4 degrees C. Soil temperature under the row cover was only 12 degrees C. So it's still cold. And if you don't have a soil thermometer, you can use your kitchen instant read thermometer, stick it in the soil, get a temperature. You want to push it into the soil at the depth at which you plant your seeds or transplants. And it's not going to hurt your thermometer at all to do that. Trying to get a jump on the season by seeding any of these plants or transplanting any of these plants into cold soil is not worth it. And you're much better off waiting for the soil to be consistently warm, and actually also the night temperatures to be warm as well, to get that fast germination, and then the growth just gets up and going and not stalling because of cold weather. You can utilize row covering or plastic covering on your garden to get your soil warmed up faster, or if you incorporate no-till practices, and you have a heavy mulch on your garden, then pull away that mulch to get your soil warming up, because mulch just keeps the soil cooler in the spring. I have row cover on my melon and squash beds now to get that soil nice and warm. Sometime in the beginning of June is generally when I plan to transplant, and it's so weather dependent that I really can't be more specific. It could be the end of May. It is going to depend on the weather as well as the soil temperature. It's going to be sometime in that vicinity, and it's going to be different for me here in East Central Saskatchewan than it might be for you in North Battleford or Edmonton. Or it's also going to be different in the country as opposed to warmer city microclimates. But in any case, that's about 4 to 5 weeks of growing in these little containers. I don't sow seeds into bigger containers because I want that 4-week or 5-week-old root ball to just fit into this, so that when I remove it from the container, it all comes out cleanly in one nice root ball. And if it were here any longer, it might get a little bit root bound. 4 or 5 weeks and a small container is about the maximum you want them growing in a pot. if you're going to be transplanting them into the garden. That really is the sweet spot. Now, also I'll mention that these are sown into ProMix. There's no nutrition in the soil whatsoever, so I do fertilize them occasionally with water-soluble fertilizer. If you've not yet heard or read that this family of plants are difficult to transplant, well, for the inexperienced, they certainly can be. But a gentle hand goes a long way, and that's the trick. When we transplant, we're first of all handling the plant very gently. Actually, we're barely handling it. Second, we're not doing a thing to that root ball. We're not teasing or anything like that. We are simply gently placing it into the transplant hole that has already been dug and prepared with some extra compost mixed in. And then we are gently backfilling it and gently firming it in. And you know, I'd love to be able to transplant all these today and show you my pretty much fail-proof method. But first of all, they're not ready yet. And second of all, that's not going to happen because of the weather. So instead, I have this clip from last year on how I transplant any plant from this family. Squash, cucs, zucchini, melons, they all get transplanted exactly the same way. So there's compost mixed in here. I'm going to create kind of like a depression to plant in, so that when I water, I will probably most often water these by hand with rainwater or with warm water. And so it will be able to hold the water in this depression. When you plant, or when you have starts of any of the squash family or the cucumber family or the melon family, you know, they don't like transplanting, and you do have to take some care when you go to transplant. And so the best way I have found is to support the stem with your 2 fingers, just like that, and turn it upside down and always gently squeeze the top, and don't do anything else with that root ball. You want your planting hole prepared. You want to set that down. Oops, there's the tag. You want to set that down into the planting hole and backfill. And you want to be quite gentle about that whole process. Give it a slight push, nothing too strong. And you shouldn't go any deeper than those seed leaves, which are these leaves that are sort of yellowing. You shouldn't go any deeper than that with any of this family. With the melon is just support that there, squeeze it a couple of times until it releases. You know, don't pull. You try and get that. It's kind of like trying to release a cake from a pan. You don't want to pull it out. And set it in gently. Support it while you backfill. Gently firm it in. The success with planting these kinds of things, melons, squashes, cucumbers, when planting transplants, is a gentle hand. And I just want to reiterate, never ever pull a cucumber or melon or squash transplant out of its pot by the stem, and don't even handle it by the stem at all. Squeeze the pot, tip it, and let that root ball fall into your hand while you support the stem just between your fingers. Gentle and tender. At this point, it's a newborn baby. After transplanting, I hand water in gently, again, but thoroughly with a watering can at the base of the plant. I don't blast them with a hose. After that, I cover the beds with row cover just to help them settle in. If it's particularly hot when I transplant, or maybe if the plants have not yet been hardened up enough, then I also throw on a shade cloth over top of the hoops for a few days, especially in the afternoons. The row cover protects them from the wind and the cooler nights, intense sun if they're not yet been hardened off. And unless we have crazy hot temperatures, I keep them covered with that row cover pretty much until they start blooming. Then I remove the row cover during the day to allow for pollination. But again, depending on the temperatures, or if there's a cold wind or rain or wet windy days, I leave that row cover on because the bees aren't out working on those days anyway. It's beneficial to keep these crops as warm as you can, as much as you can. And if you keep that in mind, you're going to have a lot more success. I don't cover the zucchini, but I can move those pails into the greenhouse, and I've done that if needed. I do cover the cucumbers initially, right after transplanting, just while they're settling in. If you have a lack of bees in your yard, pollination on some of these plants could be a problem. And I talked about that a little bit earlier with my very small planting of cucumbers, and that I find that Parthenocarpic variety to be a good choice, so I don't have to rely on the bees. You know, in general, Parthenocarpic varieties, I think, are just earlier and heavier producing. My zucchini is also a small planting, generally only 2 plants at the most, and I often hand pollinate those. I generally do have a lot of bees in the yard, and I haven't had pollination trouble with any of the melons or the butternuts. Well, if you're getting little fruits that begin to form, then they just yellow and die off without growing any bigger. They have not been pollinated, and that's why they're not growing on. And often you get misshapen fruit, and that's a result of not being fully pollinated. If you have a lack of bees, you can hand pollinate by transferring the pollen from the male flower to the female flower. You can use a Q-tip, a small brush, or what I do is I pick the male flower, strip off all the petals, and rub the stamen with the pollen onto the stigma or the very center of the female flower. And you can identify the male flowers by their thin stems and the females by that small fruit-like swelling at the base of the flower. Hand pollinating will ensure fruit set when pollinators are scarce. When I hand pollinate the zucchini, I find it's best done first thing in the morning on my morning walk through the garden. One year on my zucchini, I had a few weeks of male flowers forming with no pollen at all. And that confused me, but I discovered that sometimes in times of excessive heat or humidity, pollen will not form, and really there's little that can be done about that you just have to wait it out. And I just want to quickly cover the problems that can happen. I have been hit the odd time with some powdery mildew on my cucumbers, but generally I've been pretty lucky with no pests of any kind on any of the cucurbits, and also generally no powdery mildew. Cucumber beetles, squash bugs, and squash vine borers are all present and can be found in the Canadian cold climates, but they are generally far less prevalent and problematic here than they are in warmer and more humid regions of North America. Here, they're just not tough enough to survive the winters, so their population remains limited. I'm putting photos of all 3 up just so you can be aware, but generally they would not be a big concern. I want to also mention, because it struck me, that the squash bug looks a lot like the stink bug, which we do have in small numbers, or at least I do in my yard, but they are different in what they eat, so I've read. I've had the stink bugs damage my tomatoes, but they have never bothered the zucchini, for example. But if you live where squash bugs are concerned, then utilizing netting or row covering early and hand picking the bugs are going to be in your future. Powdery mildew, on the other hand, is often an issue. This white powder on leaves is almost inevitable by late summer. It won't kill the plant, but it reduces the yield. You can do your part in preventing powdery mildew by watering the soil and not the leaves, and spacing the plants to allow for airflow. Don't harvest when the leaves are wet from rain or dew or even in high humidity, so that you prevent the spread. And if you see it, act quickly. A milk spray, 1 part milk to 9 parts of water, actually works pretty good as a foliar treatment for powdery mildew. I'm just going to mention the leaves of zucchini here so that you don't mistake the natural coloring of the leaves of some zucchini for powdery mildew. Many zucchini have this silvery or whitish cast or blotches on their leaves, and that's just normal. That's how they grow. It is not powdery mildew. Just like tomatoes, blossom end rot can be an issue, particularly for winter squashes, pumpkins, melons. It appears as dark, sunken spots on the bottom of fruit. It's not a disease, it's a calcium problem caused by uneven watering or drought followed by excessive watering or excessive moisture. And it's generally not the garden soil that is deficient in calcium, but it's just the plant's inability to uptake that calcium because of these changes in watering. It's a more common problem in containers because they do have a tendency to dry out faster. But also container soil is often a soilless mix, which is or can be deficient in all the nutrients if not fertilized properly. The fix is simple, and that is to keep your soil consistently moist, not soaked and then dried out and soaked again, kind of a pattern. And so I thought I'd tell you how much I water, which is not a lot initially after transplanting, not if the soil is nicely moist. I just leave them alone. But when the plants are growing fast, and especially after fruit set or while they're setting fruit, I water all of these plants a lot. If it's hot out, I'll water them deeply every second or third day. I check the soil. If they need water, I water them. The butternuts, each plant will get about 6 liters or 1.5 gallons of water per watering. And the melons get about 1 gallon or 4 liters per watering. I really like to hand water these always at the base of the plant, and I make sure those depressions that I plant into are containing the water and that the water is soaking in at the root ball and it's not draining away somewhere else where the plant isn't able to use it. Deep watering these plants is necessary. You know, it can be difficult to see where the base of the plant is when your plants become full of vines and big leaves. I generally push a stake in beside each planting hole before that happens. And it just makes it easier to see later when there is all of that foliage. And if you're planting big areas of these plants, think ahead of time about how you're going to step through the vines to get to the base of the plant to water. And just a bit more on the topic of watering and bitter cucumbers. Consistent deep watering is also very helpful in preventing bitter cucumbers. The bitterness in cucumbers comes from a natural compound called cucurbitacin. It's a natural defense mechanism against pests, and it's found in the roots and stems and leaves of the plant. When the plant is stressed from heat, lack of water, inconsistent water, or big temperature swings, that bitterness tends to spread into the cucumbers. There are a number of non-bitter cucumber varieties or burpless varieties that have been bred to produce significantly lower concentrations of that cucurbitacin. But if that plant experiences those environmental stressors, it can still trigger the plant to produce more cucurbitacin, which can still cause some bitterness in the fruit. So those are the steps I take to help me get a harvest from the cucurbit family, and it's been working for me so far. Let me know if you have any growing tips or what your favorite varieties are for growing in a cold climate garden. I particularly like to hear about your successes with winter squash and melons. Thanks very much for taking the time to watch this video today. I do really appreciate it. I hope you found the information helpful, and if you did, click those buttons for me. Give me a thumbs up, a hype, and if you haven't subscribed yet, give that button a tap too. I hope you're doing well. See you soon.